There are 6 seconds of drumming that have been used in more songs than almost any other piece of recorded music in human history. 6 seconds. Played once by one man in a recording studio in Cincinnati, Ohio, in November of 1969, captured almost as an afterthought during a song that was not built around the drums at all. Those 6 seconds have since appeared, in some form, in an estimated 3,000 or more recordings, across hip-hop, electronic music, drum and bass, pop, rock, and genres that did not exist when the 6 seconds were first recorded. They have been sped up, slowed down, chopped, looped, layered, and transformed in ways that the original drummer could not have imagined, and that the man who hired him to play that night, James Brown, could not have predicted would become one of the most consequential pieces of musical DNA in the history of recorded sound. This is the story of how James Brown became the most sampled artist in the history of music. And it is also, inseparably, a story about what that distinction actually meant for the people who created the sound, and what it didn't mean in the ways that matter most. To understand why James Brown's music became the foundational material of an entire era of popular music production, you have to understand something specific about what he was doing in the recording studio that almost no other artist of his era was doing. James Brown was not making songs in the conventional sense of melody and harmony arranged around a central musical idea. He was making rhythm architecture. He understood earlier and more completely than almost anyone else recording music in the 1960s and 1970s that the groove, the specific repeating hypnotic interlock of drums and bass and rhythm guitar, was not the background of a song. It was the song. The vocals, the horns, the everything else floated on top of a rhythmic foundation that James Brown had spent years refining into something that functioned almost like a machine, precise, repeatable, and built to be looped. This is the crucial detail that explains everything that came after. A James Brown groove was, structurally, already built the way a sample needs to be built. It repeated. It had a clear beginning and end point a listener's ear could lock onto. It did not require the surrounding song to make sense on its own. You could lift 4 bars out of the middle of a James Brown record, loop them, and they would still groove, still hit, still make a body move, with or without everything else that had originally surrounded them. Most popular music of that era was not built this way. Most popular music was built around verses and choruses and bridges, around melodic development that required the whole song to make sense. James Brown's music, especially from the late 1960s through the mid-1970s, was built around the groove as a self-sufficient unit. He had, without necessarily intending to, created the raw material of an entire future genre, 15 years before that genre existed. The most famous 6 seconds in this entire story came from a song called Funky Drummer, recorded in November of 1969. The drummer was a man named Clyde Stubblefield, a session musician from Chattanooga, Tennessee, who had joined James Brown's band and who possessed a specific quality of rhythmic feel that James recognized immediately as something rare. Clyde Stubblefield did not play drums the way drummers were typically trained to play them. He played with a looseness and a syncopation, a specific behind-the-beat quality that created a groove with a swing and a depth that more rigid, metronomic drumming could not produce. James Brown understood what he had in Clyde Stubblefield, and on the night they recorded Funky Drummer, James did something that became, in retrospect, one of the most important production decisions in the history of popular music. He stopped the band and isolated the drums. He told Clyde Stubblefield to keep playing alone, without the rest of the band, just the drum pattern by itself, stripped down to its essential elements. This is captured on the recording. James Brown's voice is audible, instructing the band to drop out, leaving Clyde Stubblefield's drumming exposed and isolated for several bars. James Brown was, in that moment, doing something that almost nobody else in popular music was doing in 1969. He was creating, deliberately, an isolated rhythmic element that existed independently of the song around it. He may not have known exactly what he was building toward, but he understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent his entire career thinking about rhythm as the foundation of everything, that there was something in those isolated bars of Clyde Stubblefield's drumming that deserved to exist on its own. That isolated drum break, now known universally in music production circles as the funky drummer break, sat on a record for more than a decade before the technology and the cultural movement arrived that would transform it into one of the most reused pieces of music ever recorded. That technology and that movement arrived in the South Bronx in the mid to late 1970s, in the earliest days of what would become hip-hop. The DJs who were building the foundation of hip-hop culture in New York City in that period were doing something that required exactly the kind of music James Brown had spent years creating. They needed breaks, isolated rhythmic sections, stripped of vocals and melody, that dancers could move to and that could be extended indefinitely by playing two copies of the same record and alternating between them, looping the break for as long as the crowd wanted it to continue. James Brown's catalog was, for this purpose, close to ideal. His grooves were already built as self-sufficient rhythmic units. His drummers, Clyde Stubblefield and later John Jabo Starks, who joined the band and contributed his own foundational rhythmic vocabulary, had created some of the most danceable, most isolatable, most endlessly loopable breaks in the history of recorded music. When sampling technology emerged in the 1980s, when producers gained the technical capacity to digitally capture a piece of recorded sound and manipulate it, loop it, and build entirely new songs around it, the breaks that DJs had been spinning manually for a decade became the raw material of a new production methodology, and James Brown's catalog, already the favored source material of the DJ era, became the favored source material of the sampling era as well. The continuity was not an accident. It was the direct consequence of what James Brown's rhythm sections had been built to do from the beginning. The list of songs that sampled James Brown's recordings, and specifically the funky drummer break, reads like an alternate history of popular music spanning 5 decades. Public Enemy built foundational tracks around it. NWA used it. LL Cool J used it. The Beastie Boys used it on multiple records. Run DMC used it. Nirvana, working in a completely different genre, sampled it for elements of their sound. Sinead O'Connor used it. The break appears in some recognizable form in records by Madonna, George Michael, and dozens of other artists working in genres that have nothing to do with hip-hop, demonstrating that the rhythmic foundation James Brown's band had created was not simply useful for one style of music, but had become something closer to a universal building block, a piece of musical vocabulary so fundamental that it transcended genre entirely. The number that gets attached to this story: 3,000 or more songs sampling James Brown's recordings across his catalog, not simply the funky drummer break, but dozens of his other grooves and vocal performances as well, is a number large enough that it requires some context to fully absorb. 3,000 is not a figure drawn from casual estimation. It reflects systematic documentation by music historians, sample tracking databases, and the specific and detailed work of researchers who have spent years cataloging the relationships between original recordings and the songs that sampled them. By any reasonable accounting, James Brown's catalog has been sampled more extensively than that of any other artist in the history of recorded music. The Beatles, frequently cited as the most influential band in popular music history, do not come close to this number. No other individual artist or group does either. What this means, in practical terms, is that James Brown's specific musical vocabulary, the grooves, the breaks, the vocal ad-libs, the screams and grunts that became as recognizable as any melody he ever sang, became the literal foundation on which an enormous portion of popular music was constructed. Hip-hop as a genre, in its formative decades, was substantially built on James Brown's rhythmic architecture. Without his grooves, without Clyde Stubblefield's and Jabo Starks' drumming, without the specific funk vocabulary that James Brown's band had spent years perfecting. The sonic palette available to early hip-hop producers would have been measurably smaller and measurably different. Here is where the story turns from a celebration of influence into something more complicated. The sampling economy that built itself on James Brown's catalog operated for most of its first 2 decades in a legal and financial gray zone that consistently favored the people doing the sampling over the people whose original work was being sampled. Early sampling in the late 1970s and through much of the 1980s often happened without clearance, without licensing, and without compensation to the original artists whose recordings were being used. The legal framework that would eventually require sample clearance and royalty payment developed gradually through a series of lawsuits and legal precedents established over the 1990s. But by the time that framework was fully in place, an enormous portion of the music that had built itself on James Brown's catalog had already been recorded, released, and profited from. James Brown himself received, by most accounts, and according to people close to his business affairs in the later decades of his career, a fraction of the compensation that the scale of his sampling would suggest he was owed. The specific economics of music publishing and sampling royalties are complicated, and the picture varies depending on which specific recordings and which specific publishing agreements are being discussed. But the broad pattern, confirmed by multiple music industry analysts and historians who have studied this period closely, is that James Brown's catalog generated an enormous amount of commercial value for other artists, producers, and labels. Value that flowed disproportionately away from the original creators and toward the people who sampled them. Clyde Stubblefield's situation was, if anything, more stark. As a session drummer working for a salary, Clyde Stubblefield had no ownership stake in the recordings he played on. He did not write the songs. He did not own the publishing. He played the drums, he was paid his session fee, and the recording belonged to James Brown and to King Records, not to him. This was standard practice for session musicians throughout the music industry in that era, and it meant that when the funky drummer break became one of the most reused pieces of music in history, appearing in thousands of recordings that generated collectively enormous commercial value, Clyde Stubblefield received none of it. He continued working as a musician in Madison, Wisconsin for decades, largely outside the spotlight, while the 6 seconds of drumming he had played, almost as an afterthought, became one of the most consequential pieces of recorded rhythm in the history of popular music. Clyde Stubblefield gave interviews, later in his life, in which he discussed this with a complicated mixture of pride and clear-eyed honesty about what he had and had not received. He was proud of what he had created. He understood, by the time hip-hop had fully absorbed and celebrated the funky drummer break, that he had played a foundational role in the sound of multiple generations of popular music. He also understood, without bitterness exactly but without illusion either, that the financial structure of the music industry in which he had worked meant that he would never see meaningful compensation for that contribution. Artists whose entire careers were built substantially on his 6 seconds of drumming achieved commercial success that vastly exceeded anything Clyde Stubblefield ever received, and the legal and financial framework of the industry he worked in offered him no mechanism to change that. James Brown's own relationship to this situation was complicated by his position as both the most sampled artist in history and, simultaneously, someone who understood better than almost anyone the specific power dynamics of the music industry that had shaped his entire career. He had spent decades fighting for fair compensation, for ownership of his masters, for control over his own catalog, in an industry that had not made any of that easy for a black artist of his generation. The fact that even James Brown, with his hard-won financial independence, his catalog ownership battles, his decades of experience navigating an industry that had tried repeatedly to undervalue him, still ended up receiving only a fraction of the value that his sampled catalog generated for other people, tells you something important about how deeply unbalanced the sampling economy was during the decades when it mattered most. The legal landscape eventually shifted. By the mid-1990s, after a series of court decisions established clearer precedent around sample clearance and copyright, the music industry developed more formalized systems for licensing samples and compensating original artists. Producers working today operate in a legal environment that requires clearance and payment in ways that did not exist when the foundational sampling of James Brown's catalog occurred. This shift came too late to fully correct what had already happened in the formative decades of sample-based music, but it did establish, going forward, a framework in which artists like James Brown's estate could begin to capture more of the value that his catalog continued to generate. What remains, beneath all the legal and financial complexity, is the simple and remarkable fact of the music itself. 6 seconds of Clyde Stubblefield's drumming, captured almost incidentally during a James Brown recording session in 1969, became one of the most foundational pieces of rhythm in the history of popular music, used, reused, transformed, and built upon by thousands of artists across half a century, and more genres than any single style of music could contain. The groove that James Brown's band created did something that very few pieces of recorded music have ever done. It became not simply a song that people listened to, but a building block that other musicians used to construct entirely new things. That is the actual measure of James Brown's influence. Not simply that people loved his music, though they did, in numbers that the commercial records of his career document clearly, but that his music became infrastructure, became the rhythmic foundation on which other people built careers, genres, and entire eras of popular culture. Whether or not the credit and the compensation followed the influence in proportion to what the influence actually produced. 3,000 songs, 6 seconds of drumming, one groove that refused to stay in 1969, that kept moving forward through decades and genres and technologies that did not exist when it was first recorded, carrying inside it the specific genius of a band that had figured out before almost anyone else that rhythm itself could be the whole point. Clyde Stubblefield died in 2017 in Madison, Wisconsin, having spent his final years receiving some of the public recognition the scale of his contribution deserved. Documentaries, interviews, tribute concerts, the partial correction that sometimes arrives for artists whose work outlasts the systems that failed to value it. He never stopped playing drums. He never stopped being, by any honest accounting, one of the most quietly influential musicians of the 20th century. James Brown died in 2006, having spent his career building a sound so foundational it outlived every attempt by the industry to contain its value within the narrow channels built for compensating artists like him. If this story made you think about the difference between being influential and being compensated for that influence, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, what's the first song you ever heard that you later realized was built on a James Brown sample? We read every single one.